An ordinary boy named Irene was sent to Earth to people on behalf of the king of the dragon tribe. It was the first time he had come down to the city, and he was amazed at everything he saw. There were houses everywhere, people like him, and shops. He was walking, rejoicing that he could finally be in the outside world, in the royal city of Cerebrate. It didn't look at all like the forest Irene grew up in. But he was not happy for long, because he should not have forgotten about the mission for which he came here. His task was to find out whether the Dragon King's tribe should destroy humanity or not. Irene was raised by dragons, so he doesn't know much about human society. But even so, it was not very pleasant to know that your people, with whom you have a biological relationship, can destroy the tribe that raised you. Therefore, it was decided that he would spend some time at the Academy for Humans, and analyze whether the human race was worthy of existing or not. Inspired, the boy went to the Royal Academy to take the entrance exams. They met him at the reception desk to add him to the lists and asked for his last name. The boy was confused, and replied that his name was simply Irene, and he did not have a surname. The registrar immediately stopped being courteous, and calling Irene a commoner, handed him a star-shaped badge. He threw it like the badge was dirty and said it would be just right for the way he was. But Irene took it as a compliment and was delighted with the applicant's badge, thanking the registrar. He got angry and told the boy that he did not understand the feeling of irony at all, and drove him away. Irene was walking along the corridor, looking around. He did not understand what he had done wrong, that he had angered that person. But he decided that he had already passed one test for himself, at least he was on the list of applicants. Suddenly, he collided with a man's shoulder and immediately jumped aside. There was a whole crowd behind the handsome young man, which Irene was very surprised by. In front of him stood a noble of the Cerebrate, Bibim Nord. After straightening his hair, the nobleman looked down at the icon, Irene, which immediately made him tense up. Bibim Nord advised Irina, as a commoner, not to walk around like a tramp, after which he demanded that he step aside and waved his hand. He said it would be even better for him so that he would not bring shame on himself. Irene, who still understands little about the human world, put two factors in his head, such as advice and concern, and immediately thought that he was being taken care of. He bowed to Bibim Nord from the waist up, and thanked him. The gentlemen surrounding the nobleman immediately exclaimed, "How dare a commoner address the count like that?" It was the height of bad manners and recklessness. Irene didn't even realize what he had done wrong. The evil Bibim Nord told the boy that he would make him regret what he had done, after which he left with his retinue. Irene continued to apologize after him. Irene was standing near the reception desk, and the employee chased him away so that he could move on. Then the boy thought that everything that had happened was unimportant, and the main thing was to prepare for the exams. He entered the classroom, sat down at his desk, but passing the test realized that no matter how much he prepared in advance, the exam was too difficult for him. He thought that it would be enough to just write and read, but in the end, the questions on history, management, and economics were a complete failure since he did not understand them. When he tried to ask others for tips, they just ignored him, and the teachers loudly told him not to mess with others. He felt like an unwelcome guest, and as a result, he was told that if he couldn't write anything else, he should go to the practice area. The practice room was located in the courtyard. When Irene arrived there, he noticed that they began to laugh at him. Other applicants told him that it would have been better if he had left immediately, and had come all this long way in vain, confident that he had come from the countryside. Irene thought that apparently all those gathered were from the kingdom, and wondered if it was normal for people to treat a lower class like his. A teacher came out to the future students who will take the exam. He welcomed them to the Royal Cerebrate Academy and said it was a historic and sacred place of learning. Everyone who came here was definitely distinguished by elegance and intelligence, although the village puppies gathered among the audience. After these words from the teacher, Irene realized that it was about him, and here, as in the previous office, he was also not welcome. Suddenly, the teacher called Irene, memorizing his name, and said that the results from his written exam had just come in, and they were disastrous. The boy was upset and began to mentally scold himself. The teacher said he would have kicked him out right away. But at the Royal Academy, a lot of attention is paid to practical tests. But no one expects good results from him. Irene thought that even though he failed the written exam, there shouldn't have been any problems with practical magic. The teacher called Master Bibim and asked him to show the village idiot how much he was mistaken that he would succeed. Irene noticed that the attitude towards this young man was completely different. Bibim asked Irene if he knew why the practice test was much more important than the academic performance test. The boy replied that probably people like him would have a chance to get in. Bibim replied that this was not the case. The practical test reveals the unbridgeable gap between nobles and commoners. He touched the huge stone with his palm and continued, saying that the efforts of a commoner could not be compared to the blood of a nobleman, and he was about to prove it. Then he sent a huge fireball towards the stone with the help of his magic wand. The teacher, watching the process, thought that ordinary nobles could only scratch this great stone of indestructibility. But, as expected, Bibum managed to leave a small dent on it. Everyone was surprised by Bibum's amazing magic and applauded him. Only Irene stood there not understanding. Is that really all? All they had to do was just attack the stone. Bibum, pointing his finger at Irene, said with an arrogant look that if he did not pass the test better than him, he would be eliminated. The boy replied that he did not mind, although he did not remember that this had been discussed earlier. Did it really depend on this condition whether he would enter the academy or not? The teacher and Bibum laughed softly that Irene obviously couldn't determine the size of their strength. He looked at the dent in the stone for a long time, then approached the block to make sure that it was really the most ordinary stone, and then turned to the people, asking them to move away so that they would not be hit by flying debris. They were outraged that he was wasting their time and clowning around, and refusing to move away, demanded that he take the test faster. Irene asked the teacher if he could take the test without a magic wand, only with his bare hands. The latter, not listening to the boy, began to resent that this redneck did not even have a little money to buy himself the simplest magic wand. He refused to believe that he was capable of conjuring with his hands alone. Irene began to worry about unnecessary shouting. When the teacher calmed down, he said that he did not care how he would pass the test, as long as he did not delay others. Irene turned to the stone and decided to try to hit it easier. After warming up, setting up for proper breathing, and a special stance, he hit the stone with the claws of the dragon. It was a magical technique that the dragon tribe had taught him. He failed to cope with the power of his power and eventually broke the stone into several pieces. Everyone was shocked. Irene, after making sure that no one was injured, turned to the teacher and Bibum and asked if he had passed the test. Before the teacher could answer anything, an indignant nobleman stepped forward. He grabbed Irene by the collar of his clothes and asked what he had just used. It is impossible to hit a stone with your bare hands and expect it to explode. The boy replied that, of course, it was impossible, but he had not cheated, and there was no need to accuse him of it. In his mind, he told himself that this would be the norm among dragons, but he had to be much more careful among humans. Bibum did not believe, and then Irene offered him to make sure that he had not deceived anyone for sure. He took one of the fragments of stones and lightly touched it with the edge of his palm, after which it split in two. Everyone was even more surprised. Irene told Bibum that now it was clear right in front of his eyes that he could not deceive them in any way, and just managed to crack this stone by himself. Meanwhile, the teacher said that there are tricks anyway, they just don't see them, and because of this deception, they won't take him to the academy in any way. He couldn't comprehend the fact that the stone that had been standing here since the opening of the academy was now completely broken. Someone entered the office, and the teacher, along with Bibum, were outraged. Who disturbed them this time? But when they saw it, their eyes widened. In front of them stood an incredibly beautiful woman with elf-like ears and horns growing out of her forehead and covered with bangs. Blushing, the teacher stood in place, unable to take his eyes off the lady. She came up to him, and he said that only applicants were allowed here, and now they had an emergency, so to get answers to their questions, she could wait for him in another room. The woman indifferently passed by, wondering how people completely lack psychological barriers and easily fall under the influence of a stronger aura. As a result, she went up to Irina and hugged him tightly. No one expected that this beautiful lady would come to this cheeky commoner. The boy was surprised, and calling her Lilith, asked what she was doing here. After all, they had agreed that he would come alone. The lady replied that she was very worried and decided to help him a little anyway. Taking his hands, she asked, "How did it go?" Irene replied that he probably passed the exam, but he couldn't know for sure. She covered his mouth with her index finger and said she wasn't asking in that sense. Irene whispered that he had not yet collected the necessary data and would not be able to until he was accepted into the academy. At that moment, the director of the academy came out into the courtyard and asked what kind of commotion was going on here. The teacher who conducted the test told him that a large stone had shattered. The director walked around him, and when he saw Lilith in front of him, he knelt in front of her in a panic, calling her a master. The Dragon Queen said that it had been a long time since their meeting, and the director had changed a lot. However, she is glad that he looks good. The confused man asked what she needed in a simple human academy, and how could he help her. The woman, putting her arm around Irene's shoulders, said with a smile that there was no need for such formalities. She just came to see her little brother in action. The director did not understand how this young man could be her brother. Lilith confirmed that Irene is human, but he is still a member of her family who grew up in the forest. The teacher who was conducting the exam, without listening to their conversation, decided to interrupt them, and told the director that this redneck had destroyed a large stone. Bibum shouted that the commoner had deceived them and desecrated the sacred test. They demanded that the boy be sent away, and dubious arguments began among the crowd. Feeling the pressure of the Dragon Queen, the director unwittingly said that Irene had passed the test, and entered the academy. The boy, not seeing the smile of the mentor behind his back, who was very influential, was delighted, deciding that it was all thanks to his merits, although he understood that if she had not come, maybe everything would have been different. Bibham continued to be indignant and demanded from the director an explanation of how he could accept this rural fool. The director got to his feet and said that these people are not who they say they are not simple villagers. At this point, Lilith said that enough talk. She didn't want the director of the academy to blab about the true nature of her and Irina's personalities. She thanked the man for his fairness in evaluating her brother and added that she had absolutely no complaints. Then she asked if Irene had any. The teacher was looking at him irritably and the principal was panicking. The boy replied that there were no problems and everything was fine. He is not being treated unfairly at all. In his mind, he told himself that if he had answered differently, Lilith would definitely have killed them. Lilith, who was well aware that the boy was being biased and looked down on, said that his role was to judge others, but since he was happy with everything, she would do nothing. Biting his finger in anger, Bibham quietly hurled insults at the director for what he was doing. He was asked to be even quieter so that Lilith would not hear him. Then the director invited Irina to talk in his office. The boy thought that the director should be the most influential, respected, and intimidating person in the entire academy, but at the sight of Lilith, he shrank. He agreed to go into the office, not knowing what to expect from the mentor. He wanted to go through the whole test alone, but Lilith completely changed everything. What will his life at the academy be like now? Bibham continued to shout to those leaving that he would definitely expose the deception. Irene thought that this young man needed to cool down. Lilith put a cup of tea on the table and asked the director if he wanted to know the reason for their arrival. The man replied that he would love to listen. The woman said with a serious look that they were here to test humanity, and the people of the academy will be the first ones they will watch to understand whether humanity should live or die. The director got up from the sofa and indignantly asked what all this meant. Lilith replied that people began to threaten her forests, and there are reasons for everything. The other day, people tried to kidnap a child from the king's family. The director did not expect such an answer. Lilith continued her story. So far, they have respected the non-aggression pact between humans and dragons, and they have not killed a single person who violated it. Listened to their pleas for life. Even when they destroyed the Hall of Remembrance, where the ancestors of the dragons are honored. And then when they started stealing their eggs. But now people have crossed the line. The ancient treaty was violated by their own hands. The director, shocked by the story, said that this does not mean that it is necessary to destroy all mankind. Lilith said she understood that the whole species was hardly to blame. But he, the director, should take her words as a last warning. When Irene decides that humanity is unworthy to live on, the dragons will destroy everyone they get to. The headmaster exclaimed that in that case he would tell the students everything. Lilith just shook her head from side to side. Then she added that Irene should see humanity as it really is. No one but the king should know about this. And as soon as it turns out that the director has told someone everything, the dragons will destroy his entire species without hesitation. After the warning, Lilith was about to leave the office of the director of the academy. She asked the man to convey her wishes to the king and walked down the corridor with her ward. Finally, she told Irina that if he was treated unfairly, he should immediately inform her about it, and then she would come and burn the entire capital. These words were said with a smile, and a shudder ran through the boy's body. He decided not to tell her, no matter how bad it was for him, so as not to harm anyone once again. He needed to abstract from personal emotions and resentments. After that, the admission ceremony began. Irene returned home with Lilith to prepare, as the days of study at the academy were supposed to start a little later. During this time, he has prepared well. He got all the etiquette and manners of the nobility into his head. I learned enough about the history of the kingdom to say that I was great and answer any question related to this topic. Now he does not have such holes in his knowledge as he had on the day of the exam. He put on new clothes to look like a real student of the academy, and looking neat, went to the ceremony, rejoicing that this day had finally arrived. Then he went into the classroom and sat down at his desk. His next goal was to find friends and comrades in the new team. However, everyone around him was divided into pairs and small companies, talking to each other, and did not want to approach him at all. Irene himself did not expect that the director would decide to enroll him in the noble class, and that was the whole problem. He was already known as a commoner, and no one from the upper class would want to talk to him. If he had been assigned to a simple class, he would definitely have been able to find friends there, but here everyone would look down on him, and he would face the fate of an outcast. This class was designed for royals, their blood relatives, dukes, as well as princes and princesses from other countries. In this class, the future cream of society, the elite, and the power of the kingdom gathered. Irene felt like an outsider and heard everyone whispering around that a rat had got into their class. He himself could not get to know anyone, since commoners are forbidden to contact the nobility once again, for no reason, so he could only wait for someone to talk to him anyway. He met the gaze of a girl sitting a few desks ahead, but then she turned away, and he lowered his head sadly. Irene was sadly thinking that he would be ignored until he graduated from the academy when someone called him. The boy raised his head and saw a handsome young man in front of him. He got up from his desk and said that it was a pleasure to meet him, addressing the young man as Your Highness. He was surprised that the villager knew him. It was Prince Reed Cerebrant, the first in line to the throne of the kingdom. Irene bowed to the prince, thinking that it was very convenient that he had managed to learn all the representatives of the nobility and etiquette. The prince asked what his name was, and he replied that his name was Irene. Everyone in the class whispered, and the girl sitting at the front of the class quietly watched them. The prince gave Irina his hand and said that he was also pleased to meet him. He wondered what the villager would do, and did he know how to shake hands in such situations. Irene took the prince's palm in his two hands and bowed on one knee, lowering his head. Everyone in the class continued to whisper that there was a real commoner among them, behaving accordingly, but Prince Reed himself was very surprised that Irene was aware of etiquette and bowed correctly. He told him that he saw that he had prepared himself to respect him. Irene replied that he was pleased to hear this, not forgetting to address the prince as His Highness. Then the prince pulled his hand away, and as he passed by, he told Irina that he just didn't create problems in their class, and hoped that he knew his place. But this attitude did not upset Irene. He was just glad that he was able to prepare how to behave properly in society. Then he noticed that many people began to look in his direction, although previously they had not paid any attention to him at all. Apparently, it was because he talked to the prince and became more visible. Then Irene had a hope that he would still be able to make friends with someone. At that moment, a girl burst into the classroom saying that she had just arrived on time, but was almost too late. She, like Lilith, had elf-like ears and small horns hidden by a fringe of lush curly hair. When everyone in the class looked in her direction, they immediately froze at her beauty. Prince Reed immediately blushed, as if he had fallen in love at first sight. He immediately wanted to get to know the beauty. He walked up to her resolutely, bent down and looked into her eyes. There was silence between them. He didn't know what to say. Then the girl asked him what was the matter. The prince awkwardly apologized to her, then bowed and said that he did not know who she was, but would like to meet her. As soon as he managed to tell her his name and title, the girl immediately switched her attention. She saw Irene, and without paying attention to the crown prince, she began to wave her hand in greeting to her friend. Then she ran up to Irina and hugged him tightly. The boy did not expect to meet his friend from the dragon tribe, Mil, here. She, like Lilith, took on the appearance of a human being and became the new girl in his class to study together. She kept it a secret to make it a surprise. Irene was upset, because at first Lilith helped him enroll, and now Mil will be in the same class with him, but he wanted to complete his mission alone. He pushed his friend away and asked if she wasn't talking to the prince just now. Mil did not understand who they were talking about. Irene reminded her that the prince literally greeted her on the doorstep, but she ignored him. You can't behave like that with nobles and ignore them. You need to be courteous, Irene was saying. But Mil replied that she was not interested. Prince Reed himself heard the whole conversation. It was insulting to him that this girl did not even look in his direction. The rest of the class began to whisper that they could not expect any other attitude from commoners, and were outraged that they dared to offend Prince Reed. Then Irene thought that if it hadn't been for Mil's appearance, he would have had a quiet life in the classroom. But now everything will only get worse. He clutched his head. There was too much chaos on the very first day of school. Prince Reed approached them and called them commoners, telling them not to get carried away. The calm, measured life at the academy has come to an end. A few days have passed since entering the academy, and practical magic classes have finally begun. Irene and Mil went into the courtyard for practice, confident that everything would work out perfectly for them today. Prince Reed stood staring at Mil. Irene, noticing this, thought that since his girlfriend liked the prince so much, he could just go up to her and tell her about it, and not drill a hole in her with his eyes. But she didn't pay any attention to it at all. Irene turned to a friend and warned her that people have too thin psychological barriers, and she could get into trouble if she was too friendly. Mil realized that in this case he would not be able to see the true humanity of the students and promised to be more careful. The charisma of the Dragon Kings is also a kind of magic. Irene had undergone spiritual training, so he was not affected by the charms of dragons. But for ordinary people, it was too exciting. However, due to this, many began to envy Irina behind his back, due to the fact that Lilith and Mil wanted to communicate exclusively with him. Everyone would like to talk to them because of their unearthly beauty and charm. A female teacher entered the courtyard, her face half hidden by her bangs. Her name was Mesa. She was a magic instructor, belonged to the family of the Dukes of Rendelium. She greeted the students and said that it was a great honor for her to teach classes for such noble people. Most of what was said in the oral lessons was already known to Irina, and he was looking forward to the practice. However, the more he studied human magic, the more worried he became about the low effectiveness of such techniques. They have some kind of decorative chants that reduce the effectiveness of magic, which was new to him. However, no one else cared about it. Mesa asked the students to start using magic with the attribute of flame. Some in the class were confused, but the teacher said that this was the basic thing of all. The flame attribute is the most popular of all types of attacking magic. Its destructive power is easy to increase. She asked Prince Reed to answer, for what reason is this possible? The young man replied that the flame attribute is combined with various attributes, with the exception of the water element, and it can be applied to almost anything. It is universal. Together with the earth attribute, it can produce magma, and with the wind attribute, it can create incandescent air, for example. The rest of the class applauded the prince for his excellent answer. Mesa replied that he had said exactly the right thing, while others called him the pride of his class. Only Irene was not satisfied with this answer. He thought intensely that this was the case in theory. However, how could such an outstanding man as Prince Reed make such a mistake? Had no one noticed her? He kept his thoughts to himself, but some noticed his thoughts and thought he was up to something. At that moment, Prince Reed turned to Instructor Mesa and said that he had heard someone from the applicants destroy a large indestructible stone during a practical lesson. Mesa replied that she didn't quite understand what he was talking about. As it turned out, this was not reported to other students and teachers. But Prince Reed said he wanted whoever destroyed him to show them his power, and turned to Irina. Mesa confirmed that she would also be interested to know how the commoner got into the royal class and what he is capable of. The prince was outraged that Irene had not told them about the incident himself. Irene awkwardly replied that this was a rather strange story, and it was unlikely that anyone would believe him. The prince turned away and said that it was so, because in words it was a real nonsense. But then he came forward and loudly said that if the stone was destroyed by the real power of Irene, then mixing the attributes should be easier for him. Mesa tried to stop the prince by telling him that she was teaching the lesson, but he did not listen to her. The prince turned to the class and asked if they agreed with him. Everyone supported the prince's idea, deciding that it was quite possible to arrange a competition. Prince Reed asked Irina to follow him if he knows how to mix attributes. Of course, Irene agreed to the test, but the prince himself was sure that the young man would not be able to cope. He knew that this boy could only be destroyed physically, and no tricks would help him. He was sure that Irene didn't even know how to wield magic power. Only Mil remained on Irene's support. Wearing a tracksuit, Mil began running around Irina, telling him that this demonstration was organized too suddenly, and he did not have a minute to prepare. At best, he would make a complete idiot of himself in front of. While she continued to jump in place, Irene asked her to cover the target with her blessing and hold it. The friend said that he could provide it to her if the target flew off in the wrong direction, and it would be dangerous. She set up a target inside the crystal, and the herd held it from behind like a shield. Prince Reed was outraged by this and grabbed Irene by the shoulders and asked what he was doing. After all, he's endangering Lady Mil in this way. He only asked in a panic, what does fire magic mean in principle? The prince did not understand what kind of jokes the boy was playing in front of him, and continued to ask how dare he force Mil to agree to such a thing. Irene was completely confused, because the prince himself pushed him to this test, and at the same time interfered with him. Prince Reed asked the instructor to stop this behavior, but she replied that with all due respect, he himself asked to arrange this demonstration. Therefore, he had to stop distracting Irene and step aside. Reed was forced to let go of Irene and move away. The boy thought that the prince did not seem like a bad person, since he stood up for Mil and was afraid for her safety. Mesa wanted to give the student an activation wand, but he refused it, saying that it was much more convenient for him to work with his bare hands, and he could reproduce magic without additional tools. The instructor did not argue. While preparing for the demonstration, Irene thought that Reed was right about the fire attribute. The power is increased by mixing magical attributes. And, if you want to launch a projectile with a flame attribute, you can use a fire projectile. If you mix the flame with the earth, you will get a fire bullet. And if you mix the fire wind with the wind. But what Irene was going to use was different from all that. Many people heard his thoughts aloud, but did not understand at all what he was talking about. The boy concentrated the energy in his hands, and then began to form a sphere between his palms. He first compressed it, then mixed it with the earth for a moment to form the body of the projectile, and then applied wind magic, increasing the power. The wind rose around Irene, from which he had to cover himself with his hands. Prince Reed asked the instructor, "What is this boy doing?" She replied that she didn't know yet, but it was very interesting. After that, she said that Irene mixed the attribute of fire with the attributes of earth and wind. Reed couldn't believe that this commoner was able to use as many as 3 attributes at the same time. Only a few in the royal family are capable of such a thing. The girl who sat at the front desk in the office and often looked in Irene's direction was now very carefully examining the entire process of his magic. The instructor said that his witchcraft was different from the magic they usually use and practice at the academy. Listening to their conversation, Irene thought that in general it is quite true that people call such magic a mixture of 3 attributes. However, he uses 4 attributes at once. The next moment, he sent a huge stream of energy towards the target, shouting the words blaster shot. Emil, standing behind the target, steadfastly held it, withstanding the blow. There was no trace of the target. Where she had stood earlier, there was only a black trail and smoke. Neil came forward, unharmed. Irene waved at her and thanked her for her help. Everyone was extremely surprised by what had happened, and Prince Reed was beside himself with anger and shock. However, he quickly found his composure. Mesa approached the student and said that he had done an excellent job of selecting attributes. However, he was clearly not a role model for other students. No sooner had he and Emil been delighted by the praise than he was immediately upset by the criticism. The prince and the instructor did not look in their direction anymore. Teacher Mesa told the others that now they can practice creating a fire projectile, which is a cross between fire and earth, and Irene and Emil can rest. A couple of friends sat down nearby, under the crown of a tree, not understanding what Irene had done wrong. Prince Reed came up to him and angrily asked what it was. Irene got up and asked the gentleman what exactly he wanted to know. The prince said that he saw the compressed magic of fire pouring into the body of the earthen projectile, and could only understand up to this point, because I saw the very mixture of the 3 attributes. But what happened next? After all, in the end, what he did was different from classical magic. After all, the possibility of 4 elements at once could only be theoretically, but not practically. Then Irene remembered that they had been told about this in class. This is a human technique that few people are able to master. Now he understood the teacher's words that he would not be a role model, because no one would be able to achieve the same level. Perhaps he should have restrained his strength and made do with a mixture of 2 attributes. Prince Reed said that what bothered him the most was, which attribute did Irene use in the beginning? Irene replied that it was an attribute of water. Reed said that this is impossible, because when using water, the flame will be nullified. Irene replied that it was true that water was an anti-attribute for fire, but the energy for extinguishing is not 0, so an ordinary fire can also flare up when water is added. And the larger the size of the fire extinguished by water, the greater the overall explosive force. Prince Reed was faced with such information for the first time, and refusing to accept it, he just silently turned around and left. Irene did not have time to finish, and thought to himself that if he misused the explosive power, it would be self-destructive magic. When he was learning it, his mentor from the dragon tribe was often angry about it. Prince Reed, in order to somehow vent his indignation, began to train, non-stop directing fire projectiles at targets. He tried to create a projectile out of fire and water, as Irene told him, but it was in vain. The fire only went down and did not flare up. It was unpleasant for Reed to admit his weakness and the fact that someone could surpass him in magic. How could Irene handle such magic so easily and split the target into fragments, while no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't leave a scratch on the same target? He knew for sure that Irene's power and knowledge were real, so what was the matter? Irene and Emil arrived at the house where they were assigned rooms. They went inside and said they had come home. The maid met them and asked how the classes went. After that, she began to help them take off their outerwear. There were 10 rules in the academy. One of them reads, all students must live and sleep in the dormitories of the academy. However, this does not apply to commoners. This meant that Irene and Emil couldn't live with the rest of the students. But because of Lilith, the director of the academy was afraid for her wards and eventually allowed them to live in his villa on the outskirts of the capital. The maid came up to the boy and, calling him master, helped him take off his coat. He said that it was not worth addressing him like that, but she replied that the director allowed her to address the guests like that. Irina was embarrassed, and he said that he could have stayed with Emil at the inn. The maid told the gentleman that they could rest, and she would call them when dinner was ready. The only advantage in this situation was that, living in such a luxurious villa, Irene had a better idea of the ordinary life of the nobility and how the aristocracy lives in general. They thanked the maid and went to their rooms. The next morning, the maid knocked on Irina's room and wished him good morning, handed him a letter. The boy woke up and wondered who he could have received the mail from. The maid laughed, suggesting that it was probably a love letter from some fan from the academy. After handing over the envelope, she left him alone, humming tunes to herself. Irene closed the door of the room and began to examine the envelope. Judging by the seal, it clearly did not come from the Dragon King's clan. It had a badge used by nobles and members of the royal family. He opened it and read it. There was a short message on the paper that read, I want to meet you on the roof of the academy this afternoon. Irene thought that if he had told Emil about the letter, she would have just laughed, and Lilith, on the contrary, would have made a fuss, considering it a threat. But perhaps, on the contrary, this letter was his lifeline on the way to communicating with people. But after all, no noble disciple would talk to him, much less write a letter. From whom was it? Irene realized that she would not be able to find out until she came to the meeting. At noon, he went up to the roof of the academy. There was the same girl who usually sat at the front desk and turned in his direction. She turned to him, and calling him Mr. Arena, was a little glad that he had come after all. The young man recognized his classmate. This was the second princess of the magical kingdom of Fuldrex, Lady Lonalis. Irene came up to her, and getting down on one knee, said that it was a great honor for him to see her. The girl was very nervous, and asked not to address her so formally, because they were classmates. The boy was surprised, and got up, said that if she wanted to, she would no longer address her like that. Then he said that he had read the letter to her and asked what she wanted. And then, suddenly, the words of the maid appeared in my head. What if this is really a romantic meeting and his chance to please her? Lady Lonalis asked Irene why he came to their academy. The boy was confused by such a direct question, and all he could say was that he is an ordinary person and does not understand what she is talking about. Lonalis told Irina that he was a bad liar and didn't know how to lie at all. She was born with a divine eye capable of seeing magic and human life force. It is the eye of God. She also saw that the magic he used in the demonstration was different from what people use. The young man admired the girl's gift and could only say that he had been practicing this magic very hard. Lonalis said that he had not read the spell, and he used a completely different form. In other words, he wasn't human. Irene froze, and then calmly replied that this was not the case, he was a real person. Realizing that he was not lying, because he was relaxed at the accusation, Lonalis felt ashamed that she doubted him. She blushed, clutched her face, and then began to bow before him and beg for forgiveness. The boy replied that everything was fine. Irene wondered if this girl needed to prove anything, as it had happened to the prince earlier. Lonalis said that if he was telling the truth and was really human, then what kind of magic had he used the other day? After all, in human magic, it is necessary to read the spell out loud. He couldn't change the parts that were automated by reading, that was the difference. But in this case, if you do not use a reader, then all magical techniques need to be built from scratch. Irene said that from time to time he creates the basics of techniques in his head. Lonalis was surprised, but Irene just nodded, thinking that he might have said too much, and such a thing is completely forbidden in the human world. But the girl's reaction was positive. She said with admiration that it was just amazing. She clutched her reddened cheeks and added that it was very beautiful. Irene didn't understand and asked if she meant him. The girl replied that she was talking about magic. She was afraid that the lords would misunderstand her somehow, but the magic reflected in the divine eye is incredibly beautiful. She has an indescribable brilliance, and Irene made her even more brilliant and irresistible. That's why she was so excited about it. Irene replied that she didn't mind it, and even found her reaction cute. Then he asked why she was scared of what he had done to Mil. The girl replied because he and Mil are very unusual, and she thought that they were up to something and came to the academy with their specific purpose. Irene was surprised that Lonalis was so perceptive. She also added that it took her courage to go to this conversation. But if he and Mil are really up to something. At that moment, Irene decided to change the subject, and already realizing that the girl could easily get confused and worried, turned the arrows in her direction, asking if she was really watching and following him and Mil. She blushed again and exclaimed, was it really noticeable? Then she turned to him to calm down and berated herself for being so naive. Irene thought to himself that she was very honest. After that, he said that he just wanted to live as peaceful a life as possible at the academy, and she didn't have to worry about anything. Then Lonalis said she owed Mil an apology for her suspicions, too. Chatting sweetly with her, Irene thought that humanity still has a chance, since there are such nice and kind people among them. The lunch break was ending, and the boy was about to leave for classes. Lonalis stopped him and asked if they could form a joint club. Irene replied to Lonalis that he would think about it, and after school, sitting at the table with Mil, eating cakes with tea, he informed her about this idea. He said he wanted her to join their club. All that remained was to make sure that Lady Lonalis would not find out about their mission in any way. Irene told Mil that everything would be fine, and if he didn't tell her directly, no one would even think that he was from the dragon tribe. But at the same time, the idea of the club did not interest him much. Merle said that life at the academy is also a club activity, and she personally supports her participation in this. Mil laughed that her friend was so serious, although she understood that he was responsible for deciding whether to leave all of humanity alive or not. And just being friends with Lonalis could be a chance to test people. How would other nobles react to their relationship? Mil believed that this was an aspect of humanity they needed to see. Irene agreed that there is a limit to when you can observe from a neutral point, and sometimes you need to act to see new facets of people. Viewed from the outside, a commoner who befriends a talented princess from the other side is an object for many variables in the form of people's reactions. Meal added another argument: they didn't have to be friends with Lana, it was enough just to communicate with her. The main thing is not to forget that they need to see the best in humanity. Irene weighed all the arguments, trying to reason carefully, and eventually agreed with Meal that it was worth creating a club with the princess, and in the near future she needed to give her consent. Meal was delighted, and Irene thought that he had just fallen under the influence of a friend. Instructor Mesa said that in today's lesson, students will have to create a work of art using the attribute of water. To do this, it was necessary to break up into small teams. Irene and Meal approached Princess Lana and invited her to join their team. Meal took the girl's hands and cheerfully said that she was glad to meet her. Irene noticed that in this way they had already received the disapproving glances of the entire class. Lanali's, of course, was on a par with Prince Reed in importance. She is the second princess from a country that was an important ally of Cerebrit. Everyone would like to be on the same team with her, but she chose some commoner. Isn't that funny? Such were the rumors that swept through the class. Since Irene had met Lana earlier on the roof, it was necessary to do it again in front of classmates, so that there would be no unnecessary conversations behind their backs. The girl told him that she was ready to work together, and he replied that he was glad of the opportunity, calling her Mrs. Lanales. She said with a smile that she was not inclined to such formalities, and asked him to call her simply Lana. The whole class began to bite their elbows enviously and restrain their discontent.